The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. For decades, the USSR stood as one of the two global superpowers, rivaling the United States in military might, ideological influence, and political reach. It stretched across 11 time zones, controlled vast natural resources, and maintained a powerful grip over Eastern Europe. And yet, in just a few short years, this colossal empire crumbled from within. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Was it the failure of communism? Was it the arms race with the United States? Or was it a combination of internal weaknesses, economic stagnation, and political reforms gone wrong? Today, we'll break down the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire, exploring why this seemingly unshakable superpower collapsed and what lessons its downfall still holds for the modern world. Chapter 1. The Promise of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was born in 1922, after the Russian Revolution and Civil War, it promised something radical: a workers' state free of exploitation. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, envisioned a classless society where wealth and resources were shared equally. Through central planning, rapid industrialization, and collectivization, the USSR transformed itself from a largely agrarian economy into an industrial giant. By the 1940s, it had defeated Nazi Germany at tremendous cost and emerged as one of the world's superpowers. To many, the Soviet Union represented an alternative to capitalism, an alternative that seemed to work. It launched Sputnik, sent Yuri Gagarin into space, and rivaled the US in nuclear strength. But beneath the image of power and progress, cracks were already forming. Chapter 2. The Cost of Central Planning. The Soviet economic system was built on centralized planning. Instead of free markets, the state decided what to produce, how much to produce, and at what price. For a while, this allowed the USSR to mobilize resources quickly, especially for industrial and military purposes. But central planning came with fatal flaws: inefficiency. Without competition, factories had no incentive to innovate or cut costs. They produced according to quotas, often prioritizing quantity over quality. This led to massive waste and shortages. Shortages and surpluses. While some products rotted in warehouses, others, like basic food items, were perpetually scarce. Soviet citizens became accustomed to waiting in long lines for bread, butter, or even toilet paper. Military over economy. A huge portion of resources went into building tanks, missiles, and warheads. This kept the USSR strong militarily, but weakened consumer industries. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had stagnated. Growth slowed, productivity fell, and the standard of living lagged far behind the West. The miracle of Soviet central planning was losing its magic. Chapter 3. The Burden of the Arms Race. The Cold War was not only an ideological battle, it was an economic one. The Soviet Union poured vast sums into keeping pace with the United States in the arms race. From nuclear weapons to space exploration to proxy wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, the USSR stretched its resources thin. The Afghan War, 1979-1989, became the USSR's Vietnam. It drained money, cost thousands of lives, and damaged morale. The Soviet military, once seen as unbeatable, looked vulnerable. Meanwhile, US President Ronald Reagan launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, which forced the Soviets to invest even more into defense just to keep up. The result? By the 1980s, nearly 25% of Soviet GDP was going into the military. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens lacked basic consumer goods. The arms race was bankrupting the Soviet Empire. Chapter 4. The Failure of Political Control. The Soviet Union wasn't just an economic system, it was also a highly centralized political system. The Communist Party maintained total control, censorship of the press, suppression of dissent, and strict limits on political freedoms. For decades, this kept the USSR together. But over time, the lack of political flexibility made the system brittle. Corruption flourished within the party, as officials lived in privilege while ordinary people struggled. Dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov exposed the moral failures of the Soviet state. Ethnic tensions simmered beneath the surface. With over 100 nationalities in the USSR, many wanted independence, but Moscow kept a tight grip. The Soviet system could not adapt to change. Once reform began, it spiraled out of control. Chapter 5: Gorbachev and the Reform Paradox. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. Unlike his predecessors, he recognized the system was failing and introduced two major reforms: perestroika, restructuring, economic reforms aimed at introducing limited market mechanisms and reducing central control, glasnost, openness, greater freedom of speech, transparency in government, and less censorship. At first, these reforms were welcomed, but they unleashed forces Gorbachev couldn't control. Glasnost allowed people to openly criticize the government, exposing corruption, past atrocities like Stalin's purges, and the failures of communism. Perestroika disrupted the old system without fully creating a new one. The economy collapsed further, shortages grew worse, and inflation spiraled. Instead of saving the USSR, Gorbachev's reforms accelerated its downfall. Chapter 6: The Revolutions of 1989. While the USSR struggled internally, its satellite states in Eastern Europe were also breaking free. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept the region. The Berlin Wall fell, and Germany reunified. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others threw off communist rule. Moscow, too weak and too cautious, did not intervene militarily. The Iron Curtain that had divided Europe for decades collapsed almost overnight. Without Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire lost its buffer zone, its prestige, and much of its ideological legitimacy. Chapter 7: Nationalism and the Breakup. Inside the USSR itself, nationalism surged. Republics like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine began demanding independence. Gorbachev tried to hold the union together with compromises, but resistance grew. In 1991, hardline communists launched a coup to overthrow him, but it failed, further weakening the central government. Soon after, Boris Yeltsin and leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus declared the Soviet Union dissolved. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The Soviet Union had fallen. Chapter 8: Why did the Soviet Union collapse? So, why did this once mighty empire collapse? Economic stagnation. Central planning failed to deliver prosperity, creating shortages and inefficiencies. Military overstretch. The arms race and Afghan war drained resources. Political rigidity. The one-party system could not adapt to change. Nationalism. Ethnic minorities wanted independence, and Moscow couldn't stop them. Reform gone wrong. Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika destabilized the system. Loss of Eastern Europe. The fall of the Iron Curtain destroyed Soviet influence abroad. The Soviet Union collapsed because its foundations were too weak to sustain the weight of empire in the modern world. Lessons from the collapse. The fall of the Soviet Union was not just the end of a country. It was the end of an era. The Cold War ended. The United States stood unchallenged as the sole superpower, and the global balance of power shifted dramatically. But the lessons remain clear. Empires built on repression and inefficiency cannot last forever. Military might cannot compensate for economic weakness. A government that cannot adapt to change will eventually collapse. The Soviet Union's fall reminds us that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. And in the end, it wasn't defeated by a foreign enemy. The Soviet Union collapsed from within. If you found this exploration insightful, give this video a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Timeless Questions for more deep dives into philosophy, history, and human nature.